In terms of casting on Star Trek, what was the reaction of NBC about Majel Barrett being cast in the pilot, and that she had a relationship with Gene Roddenberry?
Okay. While we were looking for, that's the part of number one we called the character on the first pilot. Gene came to me and said, Gene was married to Eileen. Said, and I knew about Gene and Majel, and said, is there something, can Majel, could you consider Majel for that? I said, Gene, if she could do it, it's going to be a kind of minor role, but if you really want it, I'll speak to NBC. And he said, I really want it. I didn't ask any reason or whatever. And I went to NBC. I said, this is who we want to play the second lead. The character is not heavily involved in things, etc., etc. And they agreed. I thought she was just average in the pilot myself. When we got to the point of running it for NBC and they saying we should change the cast, except you can keep Jeffrey, but definitely get rid of that guy with the pointed ears. And I told Gene, I said, Gene, we're going to drop Majel. And he was relieved. So obviously there was something in the background, and that took care of that. Over and out, done. Majel later came back, I understand, in the future, some of the other Star Trek series with a role, but in this particular role, she was gone, and we moved the importance of that character over to the Mr. Spock character. So Mr. Spock became the second lead, but after the fan mail and the phone calls and the notoriety, Mr. Spock became the lead. That's when NBC called me and said, do you have any more Mr. Spock episodes? And I said, hey, you guys kind of forgot what our discussion was. But everyone liked him. Everyone liked Leonard. Yeah.
This show had, as you said, is unusual in that it had two pilots. Now, the original idea for the 2-hour movie, that never aired or was completed in that
yes,
form,
it did.
Right?
No, not in that form, but I believe that Paramount has released it as a DVD as part of the whole Star Trek madness to be, you can buy it. But we broke it into two pieces. And it became a two-parter. And we had the problem because Jeffrey would not do it. So if anyone remembers the two-parter, it was a trial with the original Jeffrey Hunter character who played Captain Pike. His face had burned up, so you couldn't recognize him. It's like the Ed Wood thing. When Bela Lugosi died, he hired his dentist to put the coat on and walk. I mean, it was the same. So right away, I wanted everyone to believe that was Jeffrey Hunter in this wheelchair. And so we did it as a two-parter, which did very well, actually. People liked it.
What was the most significant change in the second pilot from the first pilot?
We took out the whole sexual content. It was too early in the game. Regional sponsors were balking at it. They didn't particularly mind Leonard. But Leonard had been calmed down. From Gene's original red devil with the strange ears and the long pointed tail, that would not have worked. But the America accepted and the sponsors accepted Leonard as we made him. By the way, that's not an easy thing every morning to show up and have those things glued to ears from a practical point of view. But Leonard and the arch makeup on his face and what have you. But Leonard was was really great in it. The other changes were, I think we devoted more time to character of our guest characters. We more of this early on. if you look at the early episodes, you find that there is more of a mistreatment of anything that's strange. As we progressed, that changed. Much of that changed because of our science fiction writers, which I really have to mention. Before Star Trek, there were very few films, television films, that the really top-flight science fiction writers could work on. They were consigned to Street and Smith publications, fantasy, science fiction, Mars, whatever. Because before that, the films that were made were always, as I keep telling people, the giant rooster who ate Tokyo. You know, a giant monster comes out of the sea and eat. That was what people thought was science fiction. We decided not to do that. Not to do that kind of stuff. If this odd-looking monster is fighting our people, it's because she's protecting her children. We gave the alien beings a character and a reason that we could understand. So it's a really human thing that, you know, everyone is kind of equal. Everyone has a right to exist. You may look funny, you may be tall, small, whatever, but this is who you are, and we have to recognize that. We don't go in with guns blazing. And within that series, we did not. And more people have come up to me, to Harrison, to various people. I know people on the show, and said they remember that. They remember that I'm really an okay person, just because I have a this or a that. But I'm okay too, and it's really a contribution that I think was really great. I think in future series it became too much of nuts and bolts and shooting and effects and what have you, and lost some of those character traits that we played. I did one other show, to jump ahead for a moment, where that also fed back. I did a little comedy at MGM called Courtship of Eddie's Father, and I've had people come up to me and said, and it's really, you almost want to cry. I was an orphan, and I thought I was all alone in the world. And I watched this show, and I saw that, you know, an orphan, someone loved him. I'm going, oh my God. We were doing a television show, and they accepted it as something really important to their own lives. Mm-hmm. And I think when you say that about television, that's really great. That really is great.
Was music important to Star Trek?
Music was very important to Star Trek. It wasn't only the music that Sandy wrote, but when we were dubbing it. If you remember, in the first 2-hour film, in the 2-hour film, we showed flowers. Well, Sandy put a musical sound to the flowers. Sandy had all these inventive ideas as to, the big discussion always is, what does a spaceship sound like in space? In space, you can't, there's no noise. So what does it sound like? Sandy came up with the musical approach to it. So it had something going for it. He came up with all these things, plus his themes and such. And now they're world famous. Now, one thing that a fascinating story directly affecting the Television Academy was that I sat at an Emmy dinner. It was live telecast, Emmy Awards. I'm right by the platform, main platform where they were giving out the awards. At my table is Geller, Roddenberry, I think Sandy Courage, Justman, maybe Leonard, whatever, but we were there. In the category of best musical plus scoring, original scoring, television, I had 2 of the shows up, Star Trek and Mission Impossible, Sandy Courage and Lalo Schifrin's work. The guy gets up there and said, well, thank you very much, folks. Tonight's show's over. Goodbye. And I looked around. I go, hold it. You haven't given out the awards yet for scoring. So I went up to him. He was head of the Academy. You know, off stage, I accosted him. I said, what's going on here? I mean, we have 2 shows. Where is the musical award? He said, well, the committee looked at them and decided there weren't any shows scored that worthy of an Emmy Award. That's Mission Impossible and Star Trek, 2 of the most identifiable themes in the world, right? Later on. So we lost that one. But that's That was not a good night. It was a good night for Mission. Mission always won. Best got always an Emmy, and Marty got an Emmy, and Barbara got an Emmy, and what have you. Star Trek did not get many Emmys at that time.
You mentioned the writers, and there were a lot of prominent science fiction writers. How were they? Was Gene Roddenberry pretty much in charge of the writers, and how did he treat them?
What happened is that Gene did a very smart move, or maybe Harlan did it. Harlan Ellison got together with Gene. Harlan Ellison is our friend and a spectacular writer and very interesting human being. And Harlan still is, very important in the Star Trek writers' world. Harlan, it was through Harlan that we got Teddy Sturgeon, George Clayton Johnson, Dick Matheson, you name them. I mean, really spectacular science fiction writers who came to work. And they started working with Roddenberry, but about 5 or 6 shows in, it turned out that, I mentioned this much earlier, we needed someone else to work with the writers. And I hired a producer writer named Gene Kuhn. And that was our blessing. Gene came in, writers respected him. Gene was a science fiction writer in his own right. And Gene really worked with all the science fiction writers. But a lot of the thinking of Star Trek that people say, it's marvelous, the wonderful things they do, came from the minds of those writers. I mean, truly, a lot of people, Star Trek, unfortunately, has an aura around it where everyone says, oh yeah, I did that, and we did that, and so-so did that, and it's just not true. It's just not true. The myth of Star Trek, you could write a book on the myths of Star Trek, on what's not true. When Star Trek was canceled, Gene went on the road, going around to various colleges, promoting the show. At the same time, he promoted himself. As Grant Tinker says, Gene's great talent is self-promotion. And Gene told about how he designed the Enterprise, and he did this, and he didn't design the Enterprise. Matt Jeffries designed the Enterprise. Now he changed this, and he did. It's just, and that's in the legend and the lore now. And to try to open your mouth and say, that isn't true. Oh, no. Oh, that is true. That, we know it. Well, how do you know it? Well, they don't really know how they know it, but they know it. But one of the reasons I wrote the book I wrote on Star Trek is to talk about really the people who made the contributions. There were basically 5 people who were the main contributors to Star Trek, and those are the people that have to be given the credit. Not Gene saying, I did this and I did that. And I'm very outspoken on this, and Majel gets upset, and the Star Trek people get upset, and people who see this interview will get upset, but that's the reality of it. The guys who did it, with Justman and with Sandy Courage and Matt Jeffries and Wat Chang and Bill Tice, you put those guys in there who created the image, the look of Star Trek, the music of Star Trek, the effects of Star Trek, that and the stories of Star Trek. And I'm one of them also with the group. We did it. I didn't take all the credit, and the other guys don't. They take credit for their contribution, but the contribution was really very important. So when Star Trek fans hear all the stuff about who did what, believe me, follow it through and see who really did things on that show.
Let me name some of the people, some of the principal actors, just to get a word association almost, just a quick comment about each of these. But first, let me start with one of the writers, Dorothy Fontana. And what was her nom de plume?
Well, Dorothy Fontana was Gene's secretary. I only knew Dorothy as Gene's secretary. And Dorothy was always very quiet and what have you, and just went about and did her job. I knew she wanted to write, and I think Gene gave her an opportunity to write. I know Dorothy just to say hello. I know she writes well. I know she was one of the writers who I think sued Gene on The Next Generation, because they were the ones who created it, and Gene took the credit for it. So and they won, so far as royalties and what have you. That's what I understand.
But she went by D.C. Fontana, correct?
She went by D.C. Fontana. I always knew her as Dorothy Fontana, Gene's secretary.
And the story goes that she went by D.C. because women writers might not have been gotten the same respect as men.
She may have. I didn't follow in that stuff. Yeah. I was when I had a company on a lot at MGM. I hired a woman camera assistant and a woman drivers, and all the teamsters came to me and said, "You can't do that." And I said, "You don't like it? You go, because she's staying." And I've always done that. I mean, if there was a good woman writer, I don't care who it is. Good writer is a good writer. Everyone has their own reason for doing things. So if that's the reason she did it, that's fine. It would not have affected me whatsoever.
Okay. So let's go through the actors for a quick comment. This can be either personal or about their contribution to the show, whatever you choose to say. William Shatner.
I don't know Billy that well. I hired him. I used to see him on the set. We don't. I haven't spoken to him since the 60s. I followed his career. I felt when he did Star Trek, he kind of phoned it in at times. Not to diminish his talent as an actor, which he's shown before and after, and he's doing very well as far as I know.
Nichelle Nichols.
I don't. Well, it's very touchy here. Nichelle, we hired because she looks good and she delivered her lines. There weren't many of them. I think Nichelle feels she's a better actress than she really is. She will hate me more than she does now, because in the book Bob told the story about they used to bet on her whether she could say her one line without fouling up, and she did not like that story and felt I was instrumental in letting it in the book, and that ended that relationship. As I mentioned earlier, Star Trek being the type of show, it's putting together an orchestra. You get people to do that part. They don't turn away or deviate from that part. When they do, it breaks down the orchestra. And Nichelle was there for a reason. That was her reason. Personally, she's a very sweet girl. I mean, she's a very lovely woman. Professionally, I don't think she's that good an actress. Sorry.
Was this part of the whole... you talked about basically it just wouldn't work to have Star Trek with kind of an all-white guy cast. Was this part of that movement toward making kind of a multicultural cast?
The movement, and here the legend and lore is that just what Gene wanted, because Gene was et cetera, et cetera. It actually came from a memo written by Mort Werner, who was a vice president of programs, NBC at the time. And Mort sent out a memo to every single company who was working for NBC saying, we want a multiracial, et cetera, et cetera. So for that part, we specifically went out to hire an African American for that part. In the first episode, the 2-hour pilot, we had a different African American guy who was very good. But when we changed the cast, we decided to change all the cast.
Okay, Leonard Nimoy.
Well, I love Leonard. Leonard is smart. Leonard is charitable. Leonard, he's our friend. If we need something dealing with some help we need in the entertainment industry as such, you can always call on Leonard, as he knows he can call on me.
Solow, George Takei.
We like George. Talking about legend and lore of Star Trek. Someone was once asked, Bob and I were at a thing, and a Star Trek thing, and someone asked about how we got his name. Now, I'll tell you how we got his name. Roddenberry wanted to honor me, so instead of Solow, he called a guy Solow. And originally, it was going to be the African-American character. And I said, no, Gene, you can't do that. Someone's going to say Zulu and it's going to start a whole big deal, and we don't need that. So let's move it to someone else. So he moved it to George, right? When the question was asked, Bob says, well, Gene was a pilot in World War II. He was in the Philippines, so he must have flown over the Sulu archipelago. So I said, What are you talking about? That's how it starts. It's outstanding how people can dream up reasons that are so far from the truth. But we like George. George is a good guy for us.
DeForest Kelley played Bones.
Lovely, professional human being, cooperative, always on time with his lines. You can have there's nothing negative you can say about D.
Scotty, James Doohan.
Jimmy doing the same thing. Jimmy did not get along with Bill. Bill did not get along with Jim. That happens. They're both from Canada. Who knows what the background is? Jimmy was just great. The whole Scotty thing was Jimmy's idea, because when we were casting, Jimmy came in and he said, "How do you want Scotty to sound?" And he said, "Well, what do you think?" And he gave us all kind of accents, and we said that one. He says, "Okay, that's that."
Grace Lee Whitney played Janice.
Grace Lee Whitney was only on the show for, I think, the first 7 episodes. Grace Lee, I can only have really positive comment about Grace. She ran into some problems while she was there during the first 7 episodes. It became really necessary to arrange for Grace to depart the show gracefully. She was enormously cooperative, and we consider her a friend, actually.
And Chekhov, Walter Koenig.
Walter Koenig. The story about why we wanted a Russian is true. We were told that, it's funny, like 2 amateur night people, Gene and I, one day, we were told that Pravda had written an article about how the Americans have a television series about space when we, the Russians, were the first ones to do this, and this. And they were right? So one noon, we called Moscow, Gene and I, wanted to speak to Pravda, right? And of course, no one knew we were calling, no one spoke English, it was a Cold War, we didn't get anybody, right? But we thought that this would be a good idea, and we looked around for people, and we hired Walter. And Roddenberry had this idea based upon remember the monkeys,
Sure.
and they had guys had hairdos like this. That's what Walter should have, because that's that's in these days. So we ended up with Walter with that.
You were promoted at Desilu. Was this a direct result of the success of Mission Impossible and Star Trek?
Well, the following year I got Mannix on the air. I developed it with Lincoln Levinson and then turned it over to Bruce to produce. That plus the fact that I think the Desilu top management realized that I was really doing the work, and that Oscar, who was talented in networking and research, that this really wasn't his world. So he left, and they called me one day and they said, "Do you want this?" And I said, "Fine." And I stayed in my same office, nothing changed, but they gave me a new title.
What was Lucy's reaction to the success that you were bringing with these shows, from the day you walked on the lot to the success?
I think it was good. Lucy was not one to make compliments. I would send reports to Lucy about what we're doing on pilots, for instance, or the budgets on the shows, just an update, as I thought I should. And occasionally I would get a memo from Lucy saying, "Thank you for the update, Herb. I appreciate it. Love, Lucy." That was it. I mean, that was one God.
Going into season 2, how did Leonard Nimoy's popularity as Spock and salary demands affect the dynamics of the whole production and the cast and everything?
There was a confusion on the basis. Let me go back to Martin Landau, because it has direct effect on this. Marty Landau was had no option. He was doing the pilot. So was Peter Lupus. They were both so good, we went to him and said, Pete was easy. "Peter, we'd like to have you continue." He was thrilled with that. Marty, I said, "Marty, listen, come for a walk. And we used to walk around the lot. Desilu isn't that big, as you know. So we walked around the lot and we talked about what the future would be. By the time we finished walking, Marty said, yeah, he'll go on year by year. I said, fine. Just so it's okay for next year, year two? Yes, fine. That's fine. Because of that year by year arrangement, when I left Desilu to go to MGM, he quit because he didn't want to work under anyone else. And then Barbara quit, his wife, but she wasn't allowed to quit. She was under contract, but they decided, let's not push it with her, and so Barbara and Marty left. When Leonard, before we started shooting the second year, Leonard was very popular. We walked around the lot with Leonard, and we talked. Leonard's agent made huge demands. And when I spoke with Leonard, Leonard said, well, that really isn't so, Herb. I didn't really want that much. And he gave me the parameters of what he wants. Leonard, on the first series, was making 25% of what Bill was making. Wasn't that big? It weren't big dollars then, believe me. So I said, okay, Leonard, let's move you up to so. And he was agreeable, and we went ahead. But there were a lot of rumors going on. So what I did was we wrote an episode of having another Vulcan aboard the ship. We hired an actor, gave him pointed ears, and we took options on him. And I don't know whether Leonard saw this or not, but that was also part of the whole thing that I was quoted one day, which I know I said, but I said it under different context, of saying, just put ears on any actor, they could do the job. And Leonard heard that, and he said, he was kind of upset. I explained how it was said, etc. But we made the arrangement with Leonard to say Leonard is a friend and is spectacular.
As an executive, were you able to actually watch a show like a fan? And did you like Star Trek?
Yeah, I liked I did. It's not one of my favorite shows that I did. I did 7 network shows. That's not my favorite show. But I was very instrumental in it, so I liked it. It's difficult for me to watch any film as a fan. Very difficult, because I look for everything wrong. I look for the boom shadows and the flares and the missed angles. I just look for things. I started to direct, not because I wanted to direct, but because I wanted to know what a director went through in directing. So if I'm talking to that person, I'll have some understanding of what he or she is going through to achieve what I have in mind. So I remember the Directors Guild and the Writers Guild, the same thing. So I understand what's going on. It's like saying, if you have a high-powered car, you should know why it goes wrong and how difficult or not it is to fix it. And I think that executives who are in charge of productions, who don't understand what everyone does on the set, that person is not going to function well because they have no comprehension of the difficulty of doing things. I always wanted to do a course at the university, which someday I may do, called Process. Process is starting out with a blank piece of paper and ending up with a film, and what it goes through with negotiations and agents and hiring and firing and the art director and the this and everyone's contribution. It's like an assembly line. It starts here and it slowly goes along, and all these people contribute to it. Those are the ones who make the films. When I hear that so-and-so's beautiful film, it isn't so-and-so's beautiful film. It's all those people who contributed to it. It's their beautiful film. And that's always been my whole speech on these things. One person doesn't make a film. They just don't. I'm sorry.
Did you have a favorite episode of Star Trek?
Of Star Trek?
I'm sure you've been asked that a few
Many
times.
I like Harlan sitting on the edge of forever because Harlan's a dear friend. I know what he went through with it. I know when we shot it and such. I kind of like, there's a lot of them I like. I like the ones that deal with human relations or human alien relations. I don't particularly like the action adventure, and I hate monster movies. But I liked it. I liked Mission. I liked Mannix. I liked the other shows at MGM. Oh, yeah.
In 1967, Lucy sold Desilu to...
Lucy shows to Gulf and Western.
To Gulf and Western. How did you find out about that, and how did it affect you?
As I found out everything about Lucy, I read it in Variety. Yeah. I mean, I was segmented. When I said I just want to be left alone, I was left alone. That I mentioned about when they wanted Gary to have the award, to have the same title. I said, fine, he got it. I'm out of here. I just can't function on the basis of someone telling me what to do if you expect me to do what I'm hired to do. I found out about it. The chairman of Gulf and Western, who also owned Paramount, Charles Bluthorn, came to the lot, and they asked me if I go speak to him and take him up to see Star Trek. So I went down and met Charlie Bluthorn, and I walked him up to the set, and we're doing some stuff on some interior. And he's watching, and he says, why do they keep doing it over again? And I said, well, because each one is different, and the director sees something that he wants. It's all the same. Well, Mr. Bluthorn, it's not really the same. You don't understand. It's all the same. You don't spend money and he went a whole thing about that whole thing. And I knew time was coming close when I'm going to quit. And eventually it came about when Lucy sold the place for $17 million. They took down the corrugated fence. It all became Paramount, and I was suddenly vice president of Paramount Pictures. And everything was running okay because my shows always came to me, and I was in charge of them. And one day I get a thing saying, the committee will be out here to discuss your ROI. And I said, the what? And I suddenly learned that we're being invaded by MBAs, by business school graduates. And suddenly it wasn't the individual who decides creatively what we should do. It's a lot of the auditors and accountants and the business people, etc. ROI is return on investment. I said, well, there are only 3 networks. Well, why don't you sell to a 4th? There aren't any, there are 3. And it was that kind of mindset. I finally one day announced, without a job, I'm leaving. That's it, had it. I'm not gonna, I ran Desilu like a family. If you ask the people who worked there, it's a family. We had picnics at Lucy's place in outside Palm Springs. It was a family, and everyone spoke to each other politely, properly. Everyone had a job to do. It worked very well. And suddenly, when it became a business, and the business guys came in, I respect the business guys, but when they start explaining to me how I should do the shows, then that respect is gone. And so I one day went to Mickey Rudin and said, Lucy's lawyer, and said, Mickey, leaving. And he understood, and Lucy never said goodbye. And I left. And I made a phone call, and I had 2 offers the next day, head of television for Universal, head of television for MGM. Universal had 11 shows on the air. MGM had just lost all its shows. Of course, there's no choice. I went to MGM. And I went to MGM, and in 9 months, got 3 shows on the air.
So
it was very fortunate.
The challenge, though, that was...
I love the challenge.
But before you left, though, you were the head of Paramount Television.
I was head of Paramount Television.
That was a brief amount of time. Why and how did you take that job?
I was in the same, because suddenly it became... One day I was vice president, studio head of Desilu in this office. And the next day I was vice president in charge of television in the same office. I was now Paramount. And I went about my own business. I ignored everyone I could ignore. Lucy was gone. And I've ended up quitting finally.
Was this just a formality of when Gulf and Western bought Desilu?
No,
it just all
no,
became Paramount?
No, well, it all became Paramount.
Right.
All of a sudden, there wasn't any Desilu. I was there. I was at Paramount some years later to do a book signing, and I'm talking to one of the guys who leads the tours, and I said, you know, have you seen this area at Desilu? He said, what? I said, Desilu? He said, what's Desilu? I said, Star Trek was a Desilu. Oh, no, Star Trek's Paramount. And I said, I tried to explain, I give you something worse. I got permission from Paramount, someone legal, to go to the archives because I wanted to check on my old contract because I never take things from studios. Everyone takes their own stuff. I figured it's theirs, they paid for it, it's theirs. So I went to look at it. While I'm down there, I have a question of legal. So I called the legal department from the Paramount archives. And I get a different person on the phone. And I introduced myself, and I said, I need approval to open up the file on whatever, something. She said, well, why? I said, because it affects Star Trek. I'm one of the guys who started Star Trek when I was running Desilu. What are you talking about? Nothing to do with Desilu. It's just Paramount. I said, they will not believe it. And I learned that the name Desilu was wiped out. You go to the old Desilu studio, near RKO, there's no, at least then, no mention of Desilu whatsoever. None whatsoever. When I tell people, I go, no, I think you're getting long in the years, you forgot. It's Paramount. Very strange.
When you left, Star Trek was still in production. How did that affect the show, and how did you leave?
When I left, it was before before starting production for the third year. Gene had seen the writing on the wall and had vacated his office and was elsewhere. Brought over Freddie Freiberger to be the producer, and Roddenberry had promised me he would make Bob Justman the producer. Turns out he made Bob Justman, he invented a title called co-producer. No such thing as a co-producer. But they brought over Freddie on the basis that Freddie was also a writer, and they needed writing. Gene Kuhn left and was my writing partner for a while. Then he died within 3 days of getting ill with lung cancer. He smoked all the time. And I just left. And Mission, Marty quit. Marty had the right to leave. Barbara quit. They had a party for me on the set, the Mission Mannix and Star Trek people. Just the Mission Mannix and Star Trek people showed up. Lucy was gone. And I left. And I reported to MGM.
What do you feel about the legacy of Desilu? I mean, you mentioned it's almost like some tried to wipe it from memory, but do you see there's a legacy for Desilu?
Well, Desilu, if nothing but Lucy, I mean, we live overseas, as you know. Everyone knows Lucy. Usually, American humor doesn't travel well overseas. I learned years ago in selling series internationally that action adventure sells overseas. They can understand it. But they don't necessarily understand American humor, just like we don't understand British humor or French humor or German humor. They understand Lucy. And for no other reason than Desilu was born out of Desi and Lucy making so much money, becoming so important from their show, that they enabled them to buy 3 studios. They may have overdone it. They may have overreached. It turns out they probably did. They didn't need 3 studios. But they left behind them Lucy. They left behind the Untouchables, which people still remember. They left Mission, and they left Star Trek. That's a pretty good leaving for any company. When you think especially Star Trek is on the air, I think at all times somewhere in the world, someone did a study. It's always on the air. I mean, that's a huge plus to leave.
You had early talks about the possibility of a Star Trek movie, didn't you? Way before it ever really happened.
1973, Gene called me, and he said, "Listen, I want to do a Star Trek movie." We had talked about it over the years. Paramount wants to do a Star Trek movie. They will not accept me as the producer. And I said, of course they would. Gene was not a good producer. I understood that. He understood that. He said, would you produce it for me? I said, let me make a phone call. I called Frank Yablans, who was president of Paramount Pictures, and said, Frank, et cetera, et cetera. He says, fine, you do it. That's great for us. We would like to make the movie. What do you think it'll do? I said, I don't know what it'll do, but it should do well because we have a huge core background, a huge core of viewers, of audience. And so my agent started to work out a deal with Paramount for me, which they did. Gene got irate over the deal because to Gene it was all his. So I said, I'm not changing the deal. It's fine with Paramount. And Gene decided he didn't want to do it. This is after I gave Gene a movie, and I gave a lot of money to write a movie for MGM, which Roger Vadim directed. And but Gene felt it was all his, and he didn't want to share anything. So Paramount decided not to do it. That was in '73. I think they made the movie in '79 finally. It was written as a 2-hour television movie, the first movie, and they decided to do it as a regular movie, and they brought in Robert Wise. And my understanding is Robert Wise said to Gene, I don't want you on the set, I don't want you around here, and Gene was sent out, apparently back to his office. And Gene had very little direct relationship in the future with Star Trek. They gave him an office and everything else. And I never spoke to Gene again. Interesting. It's too bad.
What do you think about the spin-off series that continued for mostly 7-year runs, starting with Next Generation and then moving on?
Well, one of the reasons that Star Trek, I think, did not do well, the first series, the one that I did, was that it was a network show. The syndicated shows, the following shows were syndicated shows. They were sold to local stations, and then they formed the Paramount Network, what have you, which were all local stations. The local stations had a choice of what time to put it on. Of course, in different areas of the country, different people watch television at different times. But when it's network, it's the same time right across. It's a little different in Chicago, but still, it's basically the same time it goes on. The reason that Star Trek became successful, the whole idea of Star Trek after the first series, was that it was sold into syndication and programmed. It's a very bright guy who was a program director of Kaiser Broadcasting. And he looked upon Star Trek as being more of a kid show. So he controlled the programming on the various Kaiser stations. One, I think, was Cincinnati. I think this was in Pittsburgh. That he ran it at 6 o'clock at night, where the kids watched the shows. The only competition was the news, and the ratings were huge. And that's what kicked off the revival of Star Trek. That's why the future series were made only as syndicated shows where stations could say, I'll put this at 4 in the afternoon, at 11 at night, at 7:30, whatever. Networks can't do that. So that was what he did was great because that kicked off the whole importance of Star Trek and how to reach the Star Trek audience.
What do you think about the phenomenon that Star Trek has become?
I didn't believe it at first. I mean, when I left Desilu, I went to MGM, and then from MGM Television, I was in charge of worldwide production of their motion pictures also. So I was busy with that. And after that, I left that when, again, new management came in and they sold off parts of the studio and became the different workplace for me. That I had various other occupations. I I went into a partnership with Don Rickles on things. I was vice president of Hanna-Barbera, and where they set up my own company, and I created a television series along with a writer, Mayo Simon, and put that on the air. We did 13 episodes and 4 movies. And so I had lost track of the whole Star Trek thing till I started getting people asking me questions about it, giving me stuff that I'm going, this is wrong. I kept saying. So finally I said, I have to write a book. So I called Simon & Schuster, which is owned by Paramount, and said, I'm going to write a book. And they said, okay. And I told them basically it's going to be, I'm telling the story of how it started. And I needed someone, I have no files, as I mentioned. I needed someone who kept every single piece of paper he ever wrote or ever received. And that was Bob Justman. It's the first assistant director mentality of organization of everything, files covering every wall, right? And so I made an arrangement with Bob to co-write it with me, to do the production end of it, about how the production was done, what have you, and I would take care of the overview of the whole thing, since Bob reported to me like everyone else. And so we started writing this book only because of the fact, in my head, to put an end to all this endless stories about how this happened and what this happened. It was astonishing. Quick story. Before we made the first Star Trek pilot, I was living in Pacific Palisades, California. I would get the gas in the car into a station, a gas station in Pacific Palisades. One day I'm there and this young man comes up, can I help you? And I'd always gone there. I said, well, who are you? He says, well, I'm and he introduced himself as the son of the owner. Walt Paskey was the son. And this is Walt Paskey's son, right? He's a nice-looking guy. And I said, listen, Eddie, I may have some need for some really clean-cut looking young men to wear uniforms just to be on this show as an extra. Are you interested in making some money? He just out of high school. He says, oh, yeah, fine. Okay. Made the pilot. Got order for the pilot. Next time at the gas station, Eddie, call me at the studio at Desilu. Eddie calls. I have him come in. He's now an extra, right? Ended up being Shatner's double. His stand-in, not double, stand-in. So that's what Eddie was. And he was in various episodes standing with the red shirt in the background, right? That was what Eddie did. I am talking to some people and mention that what they saying is wrong. And the guy says, what are you talking about? Eddie Paskey was at the convention. That isn't what he said. And I'm going, the world's coming to an end. I mean, and they've also said, at our convention we have Eddie Paskey. Not to demean Eddie at all. He was doing his job. But everyone picks up all the information. Bill talks about how Star Trek started. He wasn't there for the first 2 years. But he talks about how it got started. It's astonishing. And all that stuff, by the way, is in encyclopedias and books or what have you. I wrote the Encyclopedia Britannica and said, what is this? His name is Walter Matt Jeffries. He's the one who designed the Enterprise. You have to change that whole thing about Mr. Roddenberry, it's just false. Would you please check it out? They checked it out, wrote me, yes, we're going to change it. But you can't go around to every book and have it changed. They don't give credit to the people who actually did it, and that really burns me. Period.
Have you actually been to a Star Trek convention?
I was at one in which I was at a luncheon. I made a speech no one liked. They gave me an award. And I then was at one convention to sign books with my wife Harrison, who had already written the authoritative book before I met her for the University of California Press on Gene, but it was from a philosophical point of view. It's a fascinating book, and I read a deep thinking type book, and went there and was astonished at what was going on. Absolutely astonished at what was going on. I had no idea of it. And quite frankly, I wasn't interested in going back. If people are interested and really seriously want to talk about things, I'd love to sit and talk. I talk a lot. But to go through the hype and the this and the that and...
What was astonishing?
Well, astonishing at the number of people who really like the show. I mean, you don't realize it. I mean, people who really just like this show, and they know more about the nuts and bolts so far as who was in what episode and who wore what shirt, you know, and who said this line. What I used to really get angry at, people come to me and say, or people write, in this episode, Leonard, Mr. Spock said so-and-so, really interesting thing that he would say. I'm going, hold it. A writer wrote that. I mean, that still gets me. I mean, give the credit. If you say someone wrote this, that Leonard, as the good actor he is, you know, voiced, that's fine. But it's not Leonard's thinking. It's not Bill's thinking or anyone's thinking. Again, on all the shows, Star Trek is the only one that's surrounded by this strange myth, which I'd say half of it's wrong. Truly.
Were you are you familiar with that Saturday Night Live sketch?
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah.
Okay. What did you think? Did that capture a point of view for you, that when Shatner basically told this assembled, you know, Trekkies,
get alive.
Yeah, get alive.
Well, it's kind of true. But see, we were invited for a book signing. We went up to, this is early in the game, went up to Bakersfield, right? And we were invited by the Star Trek, they have, you know, not a division, but they have Navy. There's an admiral in each one of these places. This is after I saw the thing about the thing they had in Cincinnati where on jury duty, woman shows up in her Star Trek uniform, and the judge says, "What is this?" And she says, "It symbolizes truth." And I'm going. Every once in a while I look around and I say, "What have I done?" Because people come up with the kind of weirdest things. But again, it's helped a lot of people. I mean, there is a balance to it. Many of the astronauts, a few of them are astronauts because of Star Trek. People have gone into science because of Star Trek. People have changed their life and live a better life because of Star. You know, if someone told me that when we started, I said, "No, please, please." But it's true, and it's strangely it's difficult for me to accept fully, because I never realized, to this day I don't realize the extent of people's involvement with this show. Because when I did, I remember it from day one with Gene coming in, and I remember every step of the way, and I remember the cancellation. I remember speaking to Leonard. Leonard came to the house and said, "You know, we're being canceled." I said, "I know." He said, "They offered me the job to replace Martin Landau." I said, "Don't do it." He said, "Well, you know, it's a good job." I said, "Leonard, you don't want to get involved in that. You're already playing a kind of freaky guy. You don't want to play a part of the thing with pulling off the face and say, 'Look, I'm really whatever.' It's really, you don't want that. You have a better career ahead." He says, "Yeah, I know, but it's, you know, it's this and that." And I said, "And you're working under the budget restrictions of a business-run, large organization. It's no longer little Desi. When people come to me and say, 'We need this,' I said, 'Fine, spend the money.' You're not going to find that. It's not going to work." Leonard took the job. Years later, he said, "Those were the worst years of my entire life working on that show."
So Star Trek did have a legacy beyond the hype and the merchandise.
It has a legacy. We get it from people speaking to us. It's there. It's there to the point where when we go places, many times we don't even mention Star Trek because everyone wants to know, and everyone apparently has read the book, and everyone knows this and that. But it's there. So am I proud of it? Yes, I am. But I'm also proud of Mission and Mannix and Medical Center. I went on for 7 years, and Court with Eddie's Father. One of my favorite shows called Then Came Bronson. 1 year, guy driving around Western U.S. on a motorcycle and seeing what's over the hill and meeting people. And I thought it was a marvelous series, and the actor decided not to do it at the end of the first year. And that kind of was a one actor, one lead show, and when the one lead wants to leave, it ends. It ended, you know. So
And I'll ask you more about that in a minute. But what kind of how was Bruce Giller on Mission Impossible as a producer?
very good. Bruce was a very. Gene never went to college. Bruce graduated from Yale. Gene was a mediocre writer. Bruce was a fairly good writer. Gene's parentage was South. His father was a deputy sheriff in Texas. Bruce's father was on the Supreme Court, state of New York, Justice Abraham Geller. It's two entirely different worlds. Gene was not interested in music or what have you. Bruce had a musical comedy playing off Broadway that he wrote. Two entirely different people, and Bruce controlled his show. He worked with his actors, he was on the set, and he did most of the rewriting on the show. He kept it very tight. We had to have other people work on to doing Star Trek. Just had to.
Let me ask you about some of the cast members in Mission Impossible. And one other question is that it sounds like something similar happened in that there was a major cast change. Stephen Hill was in the original.
Stephen Hill
Peter
was
Graves came
Mr.
along.
Biggs, Mr. Briggs.
Okay.
Stephen was from New York. Stephen is a marvelous actor. Never felt Stephen was happy in Los Angeles. I don't know about now, but back then I know 3 different actors, 2 men and 1 woman from New York, who came to California with a preconceived notion of they're going to change my name, change my look, make me do this to me, and they're all evil. And I gather that was part of Stephen. So, Stephen's, some of his activities used to show that he wasn't happy there. We got renewed, and we're still shooting. We're always doing well in Mission, rating-wise, sponsor-wise. I went down to the set. I called Stephen over. I said, Steve, listen, we're getting renewed, but we're not going to pick up your contract. I know I think you want to go back east, and we're going to get someone else for the part. And he seemed relieved. And he went back, and I've communicated with him over the years. He was in a television series called Law and Order. He played the district attorney, the original Law and Order. And he's very good at it as an actor. But some people, you can't uproot them and move them to the strange society here. He was one of them. So we needed a lead. I was renewed. We were renewed, and I needed a lead. The head of programming at CBS, who knows I say this a lot, we don't get along, in that I always speak my mind. And he did also. He publicly announced when the show went on the air, first year Mission, that if it lasts 13 weeks, it would be a wonder, because it's story driven. I mentioned earlier. I said, yes, it's story driven, and we think audience will like these stories, these kind of spy espionage stories told backwards, like they would like that. He felt not. He was not our fan. He did not recommend it be put on the air. He wasn't a fan. Unbeknownst to us, he was making a similar pilot the next year, starring Peter Graves, about an espionage guy, what have you. And Mr. Paley happened to like Mission Impossible. Mission Impossible got renewed, and the pilot that CBS programming made was not picked up. So I said, let's take Peter Graves out of that pilot, put him in ours. If CBS thought enough of him for the pilot, hired Peter, he was great. Peter did a marvelous job for us. He was steady, he was serious, he bounced off the other people so very well. I felt a little sorry for it, because when he first came to see me, he said, well, tell me about this show. The ones I've seen, the lead always is dressed in some weird costume, whatever. I said, wait. The next year, It'll be great. We're doing a Monte Carlo scene. There'll be in a tuxedo in an episode. We're doing this episode and that episode. And I went out to see him one day when he was shooting, and he's all in dirty, filthy clothes, crawling through the desert.
We're going to have to change tape.